The air crackled with the excitement of holiday travel. Kathmandu Tribhuvan International Airport hummed with activity, a symphony of rolling suitcases and excited chatter. It was Christmas Eve, 1999. Families, friends, individuals, all were caught up in the anticipation of journeys begun and destinations soon to be reached. Among them, 176 souls prepared to board Indian Airlines Flight IC-814, their sights set on the familiar lights of New Delhi. The gleaming Airbus A300 stood ready, a symbol of modern travel promising swift passage across the miles. For those on board, it was a routine flight, a quick hop home to loved ones and celebrations. They settled into their seats, perhaps glancing at a newspaper, a book, or simply closing their eyes in anticipation of arrival. The normalcy of it all, the mundane rituals of air travel, masked a terrifying truth. This ordinary December day was about to be shattered. The illusion of routine is a powerful anesthetic. It dulls the senses, lulls us into a false sense of security. We board planes, ride trains, and walk crowded streets, rarely considering the fragility of our existence. We move through our days wrapped in a cloak of normalcy, forgetting that chaos often lurks just beneath the surface. For the passengers on flight IC-814, that chaos arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper. It began subtly, a shift in the atmosphere, an almost imperceptible tension. The laughter in the cabin seemed to dwindle, replaced by a hushed expectancy. The news of IC-814's hijacking spread like wildfire, igniting a chain reaction across continents. Governments scrambled, their intelligence agencies thrust into overdrive. Families of those on board huddled around television sets, their faces etched with worry. The hijacking of IC-814 was an assault on global security. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a world unprepared for terrorism. The world watched, holding its breath, as the terrifying drama unfolded at 35,000 feet. The serenity of the cockpit was shattered in an instant. Hijackers burst through the door, their faces a mask of fanaticism. The pilot and co-pilot stared down the barrels of makeshift firearms. Demands came in a torrent of angry shouts. They wanted Lahore, Pakistan immediately. Instructions were punctuated by the menacing glint of knives. 176 lives were mere bargaining chips. The rhythmic beeping mocked the unfolding drama. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chilling reality settled over the passengers of IC-814. They were trapped. Fear spread like a virus through the aircraft. The hijackers moved through the cabin, scanning for any sign of defiance. They issued orders in harsh tones, amplifying the fear in the air. The silence was deafening, broken only by rasping breaths. Suspended between hope and despair, they clung to the belief their ordeal would soon be over. The pilot, his brow furrowed with worry, relayed the hijackers' demands to ground control. The message was clear: grant permission to land in Lahore, Pakistan, or face the consequences. The hijackers, their patience wearing thin, paced the cockpit. The fate of IC-814 now rested on the response of a nation grappling with its own complexities. News of the hijacking spread like wildfire, igniting a diplomatic firestorm. Phone lines buzzed with urgency as heads of state scrambled to assess the situation. India faced a heart-wrenching dilemma: concede to the terrorists' demands or stand firm. Pakistan, caught in the global spotlight, faced international condemnation or catastrophic consequences. As the world watched, a high-stakes game of diplomacy played out. With fuel running low, the hijackers agreed to refuel at Amritsar Airport in India. As the Airbus A300 touched down, Relief swept through the control rooms in Delhi. This was their chance to end the hijacking. Commandos took positions, ready to storm the aircraft. Inside, fear and cautious optimism filled the air. Hostages saw familiar ground crew, a glimmer of hope. Hijackers remained on edge, scanning for rescue attempts. The tension was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Commandos waited for the order to storm the aircraft, but the order never came. Miscommunication and indecision let the opportunities slip away. Hijackers forced the pilots to take off. The Airbus A300 roared back into the night sky, extinguishing the glimmer of hope. The arrival of IC-814 in Lahore threw Pakistan into an international crisis. The Pakistani government, caught off guard, found itself in an unenviable position. The hijackers issued a fresh set of demands, their tone more strident. The world watched as a dangerous game of brinkmanship played out. Pakistan's response was cautious diplomacy, refusing to allow disembarkation. Negotiators sought a peaceful resolution, but the hijackers remained intransigent. As hours turned into days, the situation grew increasingly precarious. The hijacking of IC-814, initially a regional crisis, quickly escalated into a global drama, dominating headlines and sparking outrage and fear in equal measure. Governments around the world condemned the hijacking, offering condolences to the families of the hostages and urging Pakistan to take decisive action. The pressure on Pakistan to resolve the crisis peacefully yet swiftly intensified with each passing hour. The United States, its own citizens caught in the crosshairs of international terrorism, took a lead role in trying to defuse the situation. Diplomatic channels, usually characterized by formality and protocol, crackled with urgency as world leaders engaged in frantic phone calls, seeking a solution that would avert further bloodshed. The international community, united in its condemnation of the hijacking, grappled with the complexities of combating terrorism without jeopardizing the lives of innocent civilians. The hijacking of IC-814 exposed the vulnerabilities of a world struggling to come to terms with the growing threat of terrorism. It underscored the chilling realization that in an increasingly interconnected world, no nation, however powerful, was immune to the reach of those who embraced violence and terror as tools to achieve their goals. IC-814 was becoming a pawn in a much larger geopolitical game. The hijackers were not acting alone. They were puppets, their strings pulled by powerful forces. Those forces had their own agenda. The hijackers were members of Harkat-ul-Mujahideen, tied to the Taliban. The Taliban saw an opportunity to further their interests. They offered to mediate, wielding influence as leverage. Destination: Kandahar. With negotiations at an impasse, the hijackers made a fateful decision. They ordered the pilots to set course for Kandahar, Afghanistan. The arrival marked a significant turning point. The hijackers felt a renewed sense of confidence. For India, the situation worsened. They were now dealing with a regime that harbored terrorists. The Taliban set their own terms for negotiation. The hijacking morphed into geopolitical maneuvering. The world watched, praying for a peaceful resolution. Section 1. Inside the Lion's Den. Section 2. A deadly game of leverage. As days turned into weeks, the hope that had sustained the hostages began to dwindle, replaced by a growing sense of despair. The hijacking of IC-814 transcended borders, uniting India in a shared sense of fear, anger and helplessness. The hijacking of IC-814 transcended borders, gripping the world in a web of fear and uncertainty. Days turned into nights, each one an agonizing eternity. Amidst the despair and uncertainty, glimmers of hope occasionally pierced the darkness. As the days turned into a seemingly endless procession of fear and uncertainty, the Indian government found itself facing an agonizing dilemma. The Christmas lights that twinkled across India seemed to dim, their festive glow eclipsed by the shadow of IC-814. Inside the corridors of power, the crisis played out in hushed tones behind closed doors. On December 29, 1999, after 5 agonizing days, the Indian government made the agonizing decision to accept the hijackers' demands. December 31st, 1999 dawned with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. It was the day the hostages were to be freed, the day their nightmare was supposed to end. The world held its breath, watching as the final act of the IC-814 drama unfolded on the barren tarmac of Kandahar Airport. The Indian Air Force plane, carrying the 3 released terrorists, touched down, its arrival a stark reminder of the price paid for the hostages' freedom. The air crackled with tension as the exchange took place. Terrorists for hostages, freedom for a concession that left a bitter taste in the mouths of many. The freed hostages, their faces etched with a mix of relief, disbelief, and the lingering trauma of their ordeal, emerged from the plane, blinking in the sunlight, their steps hesitant, as if unsure if they could trust the ground beneath their feet. The world watched, their collective relief tinged with a somber understanding of the complexities of the situation. The hijacking of IC-814 was over, but its legacy, the questions it raised about the nature of terrorism, the price of freedom, and the challenges of navigating a world where such acts of violence were becoming increasingly commonplace, would linger long after the last hostage had returned home. The tarmac at Delhi airport was awash in tears and embraces as the freed hostages of IC-814 finally stepped onto Indian soil. The relief was palpable, the joy of their return echoing in the cheers of the waiting crowds. But beneath the surface of celebration, a darker truth lingered. The ordeal had left indelible scars, not just on the bodies of those who had endured days of fear and deprivation, but on their souls. The physical wounds, the cuts, the bruises, the lingering effects of dehydration and exhaustion would heal in time. But the psychological scars, the invisible wounds etched deep within their psyche, would prove far more enduring. The fear that had gripped them in the cramped confines of the hijacked aircraft, the uncertainty that had shadowed their every waking moment, the constant threat of violence that had hung over their heads like a Damocles sword. These were not so easily erased. The nightmares would come, unbidden and relentless, transporting them back to the heart of their ordeal. The sounds of the hijackers' voices, the stench of fear and sweat, the feeling of helplessness that had permeated their days of captivity. These memories would resurface, triggered by seemingly innocuous sights, sounds, or smells. The joy over the hostages' release was tempered by a simmering anger that coursed through the nation. The sight of the terrorists, those who had held innocent lives hostage, walking free in exchange for the hostages' release, was difficult to stomach. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of a fundamental sense of justice. The Indian government, already facing criticism for its handling of the crisis, found itself at the centre of a maelstrom of public anger and political recrimination. The decision to negotiate with terrorists to pay the price of their freedom for the safe return of the hostages was a bitter pill to swallow, a choice made under duress, but one that would have far-reaching consequences. The hijacking of IC-814 had exposed the vulnerabilities of a nation grappling with the complexities of a changing world. A world where the lines between war and peace were blurring, where the threat of terrorism loomed large. It had forced India to confront uncomfortable truths about its own security apparatus, its ability to protect its citizens, and the agonizing choices that governments sometimes face when confronted with the unthinkable. The hijacking of IC-814 was a watershed moment in India's fight against terrorism. It marked a turning point, a realization that the threat of terrorism was no longer a distant concern, but a clear and present danger that could strike at the very heart of the nation. The immediate aftermath saw a flurry of activity. Security at airports and other sensitive locations was tightened. Intelligence agencies were revamped, their budgets increased, their mandate expanded. New laws were enacted, giving law enforcement agencies broader powers to deal with the threat of terrorism. The hunt for those who had masterminded the hijacking, those who had provided logistical support and safe haven to the terrorists, began in earnest. The trail led to Pakistan, to the shadowy world of militant groups operating with impunity from within its borders. The attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001, carried out by terrorists linked to the IC-814 hijackers, confirmed India's worst fears. The monster it had appeased had returned to haunt it. More than 2 decades have passed since the hijacking of IC-814, but its legacy continues to shape India's security policies and its approach to terrorism. The incident serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of extremism, the enduring trauma inflicted on innocent lives caught in the crossfire of ideologies they did not choose. The memory of IC-814 serves as a catalyst for introspection, a call to action. It compels us to confront the root causes of terrorism, to address the grievances that fuel extremism, and to work towards a world where dialogue and diplomacy replace violence and fear. The fight against terrorism is a global one, requiring cooperation, intelligence sharing, and a united front against those who seek to sow discord and fear. The lessons learned from IC-814, the price paid for freedom, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity continue to guide us as we navigate the complexities of a world grappling with the ever-evolving threat of terrorism. The journey for justice for the victims of IC-814 and for all victims of terrorism continues. It is a journey driven by the belief that we must never forget, that we must learn from the past to build a safer, more just and peaceful future.